How can you increase test weight in your crops on your farm this coming year?
You know, there's a couple of challenges to raising higher yields. One is to get more kernels of grain out there in the field, and the next is to make every kernel weigh as much as it possibly can. And when I think about test weight, this is one of the things that I'll hear from farmers, man, my test weight was down this year and it really cost me, or my test weight on my corn was 62 pounds. Wow, it's fantastic. I got great yields out there because my corn weighed so much.
All right, let's start with the discussion on wheat, because this one is pretty simple. There's lots of data out there showing that it comes down to one main thing. Now, certainly there are a number of other things you can do that'll help a little bit, but there's one main thing: having more nitrogen availability later on in the season. That's the real key. What ends up happening a lot of times when farmers get high yield on wheat, then what happens to your test weight? Your test weight's lower, and you say, well, how can that be? Why is my test weight lower? Well, here's why. Because your nitrogen went into producing more yield and there wasn't enough left to fill out that kernel and give you a nice test weight. So what you have to do in that situation is one of a couple of things. One is the long term. Over the long term, to have more nitrogen availability late in the season, you build up your soil organic matter. If you had 2% organic matter today and you were able to build it to 5% over your farming career, that's a big deal. That's going to mean you're going to have 60 to 90 more pounds come available late in the season just from the breakdown of organic matter. Okay, so that's how you do it in the long term. But in the short term, what you're going to have to do is most likely add some nitrogen late in the season. You can certainly spray it right over the top of the crop. There are some guys that do that, but you get a little bit more leaf burn that way. What we prefer to do on our farm is do a stream bar application, but that's only going to work real well if you get rain after that. That's what we would advise you to do. Just get some nitrogen out late in the season, but in the long term, build your soil's organic matter.
All right, you talk about nitrogen, and one crop that really there isn't enough nitrogen discussion around is soybeans. When we think about soybeans, they're a legume crop. They'll have nodules on the roots, and those nodules can produce, you know, depending on who you want to listen to, up to about 70% of the nitrogen needs of that soybean plant. The other 30% needs to come from the soil, whether that's organic matter breakdown or applied nitrogen or whatnot. But if we want to have that 70% out of those nodules, we've got to do everything right to make sure we have good microbial activity in our soil. Now, you mentioned organic matter, and I agree 100%. We've got to have good levels of organic matter, but we've also got to keep that pH fairly neutralized. If we get way to one extreme or the other, either high pH or low pH, all of a sudden those little bacteria that are working in the nodules, instead of 70% of your nitrogen needs for your soybean plants, they may only produce 50% or even 25%. So take a look at that, regulate that pH on a legume crop like soybeans, for example, to keep that nitrogen production up.
Okay, you've mentioned organic matter a couple of times already, and here's the reason why, just so we're clear on this. For every 1% of organic matter in soil that you have, each year that soil through mineralization is going to produce for free for you 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen for every 1% of organic matter. So in a 5% organic matter soil, that's 100 to 150 pounds. So Darren mentioned soybeans, and the reason why I wanted to come back to this organic matter thing is a lot of guys run trials on, well, I'm going to try nitrogen on my soybeans. Do you think that's a good idea? And I say, well, show me your soil test. Well, I don't have any soil test data, but do you think this is a good idea? I say, well, I don't know. Here's why. If you have a low organic matter soil, then I know you're not going to get much nitrogen out of the soil. You should probably apply some. If you have high organic matter soil, you're probably going to get a bunch of free nitrogen this summer, so why would you apply any more? It's not going to make sense. It's probably not going to work real well if you do trials on your farm. And I don't care if we're talking soybeans, corn, wheat, almost anything. In low organic matter soils, that's where you really have to look at applying more nitrogen.
The other thing is, if you're drastically short in micronutrients, that's going to limit nitrogen production from nodules, but also just your protein building in your plant. You do need, in addition to nitrogen, you need good levels of micronutrients too. That's something to keep an eye on. If you took good soil tests this fall, look back at those soil tests, check what those micronutrient levels are, because it may not just be a maintenance level that you need to be applying when you're planting your crop next spring. You may need to put on additional build levels of micronutrients to try to get them up to where they need to be.
Micronutrients are important, but sulfur is as well. And the thing that I would bring up here is, if you look at nitrate, sulfate, and boron, those are all very leachable. So in other words, I don't care if you've applied them in the past, you probably need to apply them again this year. So I'd take a real hard look at your nitrogen, your sulfur, and your boron every single year for every single crop.
You know, speak about low test weight, Brian. We had some ground that was low test weight not that many years ago, where the fertilizer balance was just not right in the soil. Those soils, we were putting on plenty of nitrogen and wondering, well, why is that not working? Yet we had excessive levels, like in the ground that we're standing on right here, of magnesium, and all of a sudden we have to put on way more nitrogen when we've got high magnesium soils to do the same job if we had our soils in balance with the nutrient levels. So like in this soil, for example, we're applying a lot more calcium, and it's helping out in things like test weight. And you say, well, wait a second, why is that going on? Because our nitrogen efficiency has gone way up, and we've got our nutrients back in balance. Everything in our soil is working better. And when you have poor test weights in your grain, you need to look at your fertility program, and you need to look at those soils that you're dealing with, because if you've got issues in the soils that you're not dealing with, it's going to cost you in test weight. Now, one other caution that I'll give you, let's say that you put some low test weight corn into a bin, and I'll just use corn for an example. When we see low test weight corn, those kernels are just a little bit softer. It seems like we have more spoilage issues with them. Keep a close eye on low test weight grain. This is where we see spoilage issues and big time storage problems. We don't want that to happen for you.
One last thing I guess I'd mention, Darren talked about high magnesium soils. Potassium is really the big thing in high magnesium soils. A lot of times we have just terrible issues getting potassium into the plant. So you've got to get that potassium base saturation up above 4%. That does help out standability. It does help out, with any lodging issues that you've been having. But in addition to that, you get better grain quality, and test weight is one of the side benefits of that.
Well, one other thing to improve test weight in any grain is keeping weeds out of the field that are competing against your crop. Weeds like our weed of the week. Can you identify this week's weed?